seminar of the quarter. And we have a special guest speaker for the last session, Jonathan Gifford. And I'm introducing Jonathan partly because I've known him for a while. We were actually graduate students together. So you can see he looks like about 35, so that makes me about that age too. Jonathan's mumbling something about I was a year ahead of him, but actually that's not true. So I've enjoyed Jonathan. He's been doing a lot of interesting research over the years. We were just talking that his first faculty position was doing MIS, which you probably don't even know what that is, Management Information Systems. And he does have a degree in civil engineering. He was in the same program with me, transportation engineering at UC Berkeley. And then he got the faculty position at Carnegie Mellon. And then he went to George Mason to the policy school there, and he's been there ever since. And he's been doing a lot of work on, he's gradually migrated into, I didn't check exactly your abstract for today, so, but Jonathan's doing a lot on public-private partnerships and infrastructure. And it's really, he's had a lot of impact on some of the decision, thinking going on in Virginia where he is, as well as in Washington, D.C. And so I think this is a kind of a fresh insight that good for us to hear. And Jonathan's very thoughtful about this. So we're very pleased to have you here. I'm especially pleased that you're here. And so let me hold on, everyone, and we'll hook up Jonathan.
Okay. Okay. Great. So is that picking up, I think, on the mics? Great. Okay, and we go until 2:30? Is that the plan? Or? Oh, okay. So just to gauge it, and I guess this thing makes it move forward. So anyway, it's a pleasure to be here, and I originally entitled this talk, Delivering, a new generation of delivering transportation systems, and Dan suggested this title because that word, and I think he was right as I thought about it, because we are, and I'll talk a little bit about interest in modes of delivering transportation services, but that's not the way we think about it an awful lot of the time. So let's see if this, so what I wanted to talk about, I'll talk a little about the scope of the presentation and motivation, some changes in the way, changes in transportation infrastructure, some questions that arise as a result of that in the way we govern infrastructure systems, and looking at public-private partnerships as a mechanism for governing them and delivering them, and talk a bit about what are public-private partnerships, which I'll call P3s, and then look at how Virginia has institutionalized their P3 operation, some conclusions and Q&A. And I'm happy to take questions as we go, if clarifying questions or any type of question as we go. So if you have thoughts, feel free to raise them. So the policy question really is, what is the impact of the emerging trends that we're seeing in transportation delivery? How should governments prepare for these changes? And how do we minimize the risk to governments and to citizens, including opportunism? Because a lot of concern as people hear about these public-private partnerships is that people are taking advantage of government, that it's a rip-off of some sort. Bringing the profit motive in is going to hurt the public interest. So we'll talk, I think it's important to focus on that. Things that are driving changes in transportation, demographic trends, technology, all kinds of things happening on the data, device, efficiency front, and preferences, changes, we think. We're observing changes in preferences for urban living, and some higher expectations for what we expect out of our transportation system. The motivation is from my standpoint, the really part that I'm interested in is what are the institutional dimensions of this? How do we operationalize these in organizations to deliver this new generation of transportation services? And our initial paper, which we're writing now, so it's not ready, but there's a International Society for the New Institutional Economics, which is in Cambridge this summer. So we're working on that paper right now to talk about this in that context. So in terms of drivers that are transforming transportation, just generational differences in what people expect out of transportation. And the important point really is preferences aren't stationary. You know, we shouldn't assume, and some of our neoclassical economic models assume stationary preferences, but they change. They change within a generation. As that generation ages, my expectations and needs for transportation are different than my mother's, who's now in her 80s, and I worry when she loses the ability to drive, what's that going to do to her lifestyle, her independence, her mobility? Folks in this room, what are your expectations about transportation? What kind of preferences do you have? An important part of that is that we are expecting our transportation systems to deliver a bit of a different, really a 24/7 carefully managed and controlled system. It's more than just a facility. It is a facility that's bundled with information, with control, that's giving constant safety, reliability, and performance. So we want, to have very good information about the system. They're very different than the systems we were operating a few generations ago. The emergence of sharing facilities, it's a huge change. I'm, I guess, optimistic that we may be at a point where our ability to deliver shared use is becoming technologically and practically possible. Shared bike system. This is a picture of the DC system, but these systems are all over the world. Car2Go, familiar. Everybody know what anybody not know what Car2Go is? I don't know if you have Car2Go here in Davis. Yeah. So Zipcar, Car2Go is interesting. It's different than Zipcar because it's point to point. So you pick up the car, you use it, you pay, I think, 42 cents a minute, and when you reach your destination, you park it, and you can park it anywhere, any legal spot. You don't have to pay parking. So there's a fleet of these, about 300 of these in DC. I think they're increasing the fleet to 600. It's built by Daimler. It's all over the world. The folks in the shared car community look with great suspicion on a car manufacturer's system. Is this a way to hook people on cars and sell more cars, or is it a new type of transportation? Uber and Lyft you've got here in Davis, and they are transforming things. I was in Hunan province in China over the summer, and of course they have Uber. It's not the most popular shared taxi system, but the number of legal taxis in Changsha is very limited. And so Uber, and there's another local application for a jitney service for informal transportation in Changsha. Parking, being transformed. San Francisco is a leader in different ways of managing parking, but parking mobile seems to be emerging as a dominant, payment provider where you can pay from your smartphone. But a lot of things about advanced reservations for parking, real-time information about parking status and availability, and so forth. So this is a very different type of transportation service than we've seen before. And something's happening with autonomous vehicles. We don't know whether it's really just over the horizon or whether it will be a decade or more before that's there. But it's an exciting time in terms of thinking about autonomous vehicles. 4 states, DC now have laws that make it allowable. So maybe we're there. I have to say on the other side of that I was at the 1995 test track in San Diego of the Was it 97? Okay. The big test of the automated vehicle control systems, and that was pretty impressive. And I thought, well, this is just around the corner, and here we are almost 20 years later, and it's still just around the corner. So it may be that it's going to be longer than we think, but I think there's some promising things that are happening there. So it raises a question: are we talking about a service, or are we talking about a facility? And civil engineering departments, traditionally have focused very much on facility delivery, the planning, design, and construction of a facility. But there's a lot more going on than just providing a facility, because transportation is a service. It's not only the facility, it's also the operations and maintenance, it's the ITS, it's a bundle of information services that go along with that facility. Shared use that I mentioned. So maybe you've heard the term software as a service. It's sort of a hot term in the IT world these days, that software isn't a package, it's a service. You don't buy software necessarily to install, but you're using software as a service. I think we can think analogously of transportation and infrastructure as a service. And then we think about delivering it. Is it constructing it, or is it delivering it? So we looked at planning, design, construction, and organizing for that purpose, or are we organizing for service delivery? That's a very different type of expectation about organizations involved in transportation. So let me pause there. Comments or questions, anything? So the challenges of governance. How do you govern this new suite of transportation as a service? And that, that is a real can of worms. Uber has blown up taxi limousine. All of a sudden, a very stable, staid industry that hadn't changed for 50 years, and all of a sudden, it's been blown up. Parking, what could be more boring than parking? But parking is getting blown up. But part of it on the governance side, facing real challenges. Tight budgets, most governments facing very tight budgets, very little appetite for raising taxes and increasing the funding for governments, expanding liabilities, pension liabilities, retiree health liabilities, infrastructure deficits that because of deferred maintenance. So a huge generation of facilities built in the 50s, 60s, and 70s that are now at their design life that need to be renewed, expanded, restored, or abandoned, that will soon, in some cases, become unsafe to use. Public productivity has not been moving very fast. It's facing a lot of constraints because of rigid procedures, hiring procedures, procurement. Very difficult to have a procurement that can procure the latest types of technologies, work rules that restrict what the different workers in an organization can do. Political support for raising taxes, and in cities, limited physical space. We've built out a huge built environment. So going back and retrofitting that with these new services faces the fact that you're displacing. You're not doing greenfield development in many cases. You're dealing with a built-up area. So the challenge is, within the context of these tight budgets and rigid governmental structures, how do you strike the right balance between infrastructure development and the operations and maintenance? Are you deferring O&M? In Virginia, we have a public fund. Until last year, the first call on public budgets for transportation was O&M. You had to maintain existing infrastructure before you allocate funds for new construction. And there's a pot of money for construction and a pot of money for maintenance. But if you don't have enough in the maintenance pot, then the funds cross over from construction to maintenance. And we were on a pathway to have all of our construction funds crossing over to maintenance by the end of this decade. They just raised taxes in Virginia in a clever, confusing, publicly non-transparent way, and we're able to get a tax increase through, but there's not much appetite for that. it's difficult to acquire new technologies. The procurement cycle is often much longer than the technology cycle. I visited Presidio Parkway in San Francisco on Monday. Part of that is being procured as a public-private partnership. One of the interesting things in that project is that the technology that was specified and purchased in phase one of that project, which is open and operating, is now obsolete and has been replaced. So, one of the folks at San Francisco County Transportation Authority, which is one of the funding agencies, said under traditional procurement, under Caltrans procurement, we would be buying that old technology because it would be too difficult to go back and put in. It's expensive to modify the contract. But under the P3 procurement, the concessionaire is actually able to go back and change the ITS specifications and buy the latest and most available technology that can be delivered in that bridge, or in that structure. So that is difficult to do under traditional procurement, and these changing preferences. Uber, Lyft. I think it's fair to say 5 years ago this was not on the radar. 10 years ago, certainly not on the radar. Smartphones are 10 years. 10 years on the radar, and who knows what's next. Dan said that when I started teaching, I was teaching management information systems. And think about, we're trained by Bill Garrison, think about the S-curve of technology deployment, where you have the early stages of invention and then a very rapid adoption period and then maturation. So I was thinking, back in the early 90s and the late 80s that we were, somewhere up here on the IT development front. We had mini computers and no idea, that where we would be 25 years later with increasing, the capabilities that we have today. So it's very hard, even for smart people, to predict where we are on that evolution curve. And so we don't want to think that we have figured out most of what we're going to figure out today in 2015, because by 2025 we'll be in a new generation. And regions are competing to attract productive and creative workers. So trying to create an environment that's attractive to them, that exploiting that changing set of preferences about urban living, walkability, and so forth, those are difficult challenges as well. So let's go back to NASA deploying the Apollo program in the 1960s. President Kennedy, made a pledge that by the end of the 1960s we were going to place a man on the moon. A very well-defined objective, and this isn't something you could buy in markets. You had to build your own. Of course, they used a lot of private contractors to deliver it, but NASA basically designed, built, operated, and maintained a delivery system to deliver and put a man on the moon. Where are we today with state DOTs? They have now an option for purchasing infrastructure in markets. We don't necessarily have to build it ourselves. You're making a make or buy decision. Well, the buy decision is now beginning to be a little bit more possible with some of these more advanced procurement methodologies. And so creating teams to try to acquire these systems and capabilities in a So think about it from the Apple standpoint. What is there? Everything says designed in California, built, in the world, I think is the tagline that they've got. So it's that creativity, the ability to create a product, but then source it and deliver it from around the world. So we have globalization, technological, and contractual arrangements that allow that global supply chain for producing and delivering smartphones and the Apple iPhone, creating, the Apple just replaced AT&T in the Dow Jones Industrial Average. I mean, suddenly it's, by far the biggest corporation, largest capitalization company in the world. So state DOTs are challenged to deliver this new set of services and increasing attention to O&M, trying to get some competitive advantage in quality control, using contractors which have always played a very important role in delivering planning, design, and construction of facilities, but O&M has traditionally been more of a state function. So we have some mechanisms, some opportunities for changing that governance model and perhaps delivering in a better way. Even if we didn't have the fiscal constraints, we might still want to be looking at these options. One of the companies we talked to says it's not a necessary evil. It's actually a better way of doing business. And I think that's the premise. That's the arguable, testable hypothesis. Is it really a better way of doing business? And that's some of the work we're trying to do, is to say, is this public-private partnership delivery model a better way of doing business? How do you design it and deliver it in a way that protects the public interest? Agencies are, Control Center. This is one in Maryland, but these are often procured. They're not delivered necessarily by the state agency. Virginia has contracted out all of its op centers in a single contract statewide, so that they're getting that service by contracting it out. On the supply side, we're seeing emergence of a set of firms that are capable of delivering infrastructure services over the lifetime of an asset or a system from around the world. Some of them are U.S. firms listed here, but a lot of them are coming from outside the U.S. So ACS Dragados, Abertis, Sintra, Ferrovial, they're very active in the U.S. market. They're beginning to move into the U.S. market. UK, Australia in particular, has had a number of firms that have been very active. Macquarie financed the $1.6 billion purchase of the 99-year concession lease for the Chicago Skyway back in 2008. So that's real money. And they're able to promise and deliver in a contract over the course, in that case, 99 years. So we're still early, but that is the commitment, the financial commitment, to deliver that service for 99 years. So let me just pause there and say if I've antagonized anyone enough to ask a question yet, or all right, I'm working on it. So, okay.
Keeping the powder dry so far.
Pardon?
We're keeping the powder dry so far.
Okay, well, that's good. So what is a P3? At the simplest level, it's an agreement between a public and a private partner to deliver a bundle of services. Traditionally, we've used, and you're probably familiar with the design, bid, build model, where the state contracts out the design of a facility, accepts the design, then bids out the construction of that facility. Construction occurs, any change orders that are required because of changing technology or unexpected, unplanned conditions then lead to a change order, which increases the cost of the, typically 99% of the time increases the cost of the construction contract. And there's some difficulty because you can't really begin the construction until you've completed and accepted the design, so it can elongate the delivery time for projects. Design build has been an innovation that's been around for a couple of decades and is being increasingly adopted by asset owners, so that you actually award a single contract for the design and the construction of a facility. That has a couple of advantages. One, you have a strong incentive as the design build contractor to design a constructible, easily constructible facility. So you think through the constructability in advance, and you're accountable. You are accountable for delivering the constructed facility. So if your design had problems that made it unconstructible, that you have to eat the cost of the changes. So you can begin your rough level 1 construction, clearance, and so forth before the design is complete. So there's some advantages to that, and many state agencies are beginning to adopt design build already. Design build, operate, and maintain extends the integration further because, of course, the O&M costs of a facility depend on the design and the construction. And so if you can bundle design, build, operate, and maintain, you're actually designing with life cost in mind. So you're trying to look at life cycle cost and incorporate that into your initial design and construction. You may spend more money initially to have an easier to maintain, cheaper to maintain. I think at a generalization level, yes, it's true, and yes, it fits in here. Of course, we're a very disaggregated country, so there's, to characterize the practices of 50 state DOTs and hundreds of city departments of transportation, there's always an exception to that rule. But there is a strong incentive to have clear procurement and to protect the integrity of the procurement process, to have clearly defined requirements, and low bid is a good one. There's nobody can question in court that $1,000 is less than $1,200. There's just so having a really unambiguous selection criteria is an important one. And in terms of the design, there's a strong incentive under limited budgets. If you're going to try to build a broad range of facilities that are geographically distributed around your jurisdiction, that you try to minimize the initial construction cost. So, should you build thicker pavements in order to reduce the frequency of rehabilitation? That is what you get under this model. It's possible for visionary leaders under the traditional model to insist on higher initial cost designs. And certainly some jurisdictions have done that, to say we're going to build fewer miles of highway, but better, because we are trying to protect the public well-being. But there's a lot of political pressure when you don't have enough funds to build out a full system to say, let's try to economize and spread the wealth around so that we are serving a broader number of our voters, and after all, these are the guys who are electing us to office. So it's not an unreasonable contention. So that tension between initial design and long-term O&M, I think, is there, and it's old news. I mean, I think Wayne Murray wrote a sort of a shocker of an article in 1987 or 88. AASHTO, American Association of State Highway and Transportation Officials, took a delegation of State Department of Transportation officials to Europe for a technical tour to look at transportation, construction, operations, and maintenance contracts. He came back and he wrote something for TR News, which is the Transportation Research Board bi-monthly magazine, saying the pavements are better. They do it better than we do in America. European pavements are better than American pavements. And it's not because they don't have as much traffic, because they have more. It's not because they don't spend as much, that they spend more because we spend more. He sort of, I think he was excommunicated shortly after writing that article. But, it was a wake-up call to say, well, there really is an important feedback. And especially, we built out a huge system of 45,000 miles of interstate highways between 1956 and 1990, approximately. Well, a lot of that stuff is now coming of age and needs to be rehabilitated. And so we're really living, part of our infrastructure deficit is the initial construction practices that we adopted, back in that initial rollout of that system. So it's a real trade-off, and it's not one that's obvious because there are changes in materials and construction technologies and so forth. So you may not automatically want to build something that lasts forever. You may want something that's disposable because you think you wouldn't want to build an ITS system that lasted forever because 5 years from now the technology is going to be obsolete. So where you make those trade-offs, I think, is a complicated and difficult. So there are these different procurement mechanisms that are coming onto the scene and are beginning to become usable. I've said this already, bundling can reduce life cycle costs, or that's the contention. And something very important is the allocation and realization of risk. Under traditional delivery, almost all of the risk resides with the public asset owner. So if there are, there's a risk that the design is wrong. And under traditional design, bid, build, that risk is, with the state DOT or the asset owning agency. If you have approved and accepted a design that has flaws in it and didn't realize it, and you've now bid that out for construction, you are at risk if the constructor comes back to you and says, sorry, but we can't build this, or the subsoil conditions are not the ones that you have designed for, or any of the other many reasons. So the risks, the downside of those risks hit the public owner in most cases. I was going to talk about the San Francisco Bay Bridge. I've been hearing a lot about that project, and people have been sending me links about whatever it is, the weep holes that got filled in as the most recent thing that's going to cost another $17 million to fix. But that's a perfect example. I think Trans Bay Terminal in San Francisco is a project that's been mentioned as one that's being procured under traditional delivery. I don't know the details of that, but that's been what. Well, I'm not going to tell you very much because I am not very well informed about the Bay Bridge. And I'm being recorded here, so I'm even going to be held accountable. And there's an allegation that some folks at Caltrans might even watch this presentation. So I don't want to get a fatwa out on me if I make factual misstatements. But there are large-scale facilities where if you do it through design, bid, build, all the risk falls back on the public owner. And from what I've read on this recent thing about caulking the drain holes or something like that, that is, Caltrans has said that shouldn't have been approved, and they're going to have to pay the cost of that wasn't a contractor error, that was an error on the part of Caltrans. But what are the risks that we deal with? Political risk, changes in laws. Sometimes this is less of an issue in the U.S. market, but still, I think, an important potential risk. Demand risk is a big deal. Who takes the demand risk on projects? Are you going to build a toll road, and then the tolls don't materialize because the demand isn't there? You've mistaken in your demand forecasts, and you lose. And so if you have a P3 that is a demand risk project, that is the concessionaire is taking the demand risk, and the traffic doesn't materialize, well, that's something that's borne by the concessionaire, not the public asset owner. And of course, it's not just private projects that have demand risk errors. Many public projects have demand errors, demand forecasting errors. It's technically challenging, and then there's also some conflict of interest sometimes between the people who prepare the forecasts and who are bearing the financial risk, and so that's a problem as well. CapEx risks, construction cost overruns, a very big problem in the transportation business, having cost overruns. Changes in global commodity prices or availability can also have a significant effect on construction. O&M, there's a lot of components to O&M in terms of labor and materials and so forth. So that is a risk that has to be managed. Financing, is also a huge risk. What's the cost of financing? And that's played an important part in some big American projects and been very, very costly in some cases. We've gone through financial crisis in the last 6 years, and that had huge impacts on some of these transportation projects. So what are the advantages? I've already touched on the first one, but there's a little bit more to that story. What do we mean by accelerated delivery and availability to the public? Part of it is that once you start a project, you finish it faster. But the second component of that is that that you are able to start it sooner, sometimes by years or decades, because you have the capital available to actually do the construction. If you're waiting for state budget processes or federal budget processes to build up enough money to finance the construction, you can wait sometimes for decades for the funds to be available. And so if you are able to access the private capital markets, you can sometimes bring a project to delivery and begin generating social benefits many, many years earlier. With P3s, we've also seen that they're being delivered early in that, the contractual delivery date is X, and they're delivering the project, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 months early in some cases. So on budget, on time delivery, I've mentioned access to private capital markets. Haven't really talked about ATCs, alternative technical concepts, but sometimes if you are putting the design, build, finance, operate, and maintain out for concession, your concessionaire will come back and say, well, we have a better idea about the way to deliver this facility. We can change the design and save millions of dollars on construction, or we can use different materials and save construction. To go back to a Presidio Parkway example, again, phase 2 of that project, which is being procured with the P3, they're using the visual appearance of the viaducts for that roadway are, long set, the product of many, 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 many public meetings and public deliberations. So you can't do anything to fiddle with the appearance of the final structure. But what's going on in the foundations of the columns, we were told, is quite different between phase 1 and phase 2. And the concessionaire has done a different use of pile design that they feel has saved quite a bit of money and delivers an equivalently safe and reliable product. And so, the extent to which you allow alternative technical concepts to be utilized is a big issue with whether P3s can make a difference. If you want all your projects to adhere to the state design guideline, which is a set of manuals or software that's very complex, you may not be able to have very many innovative designs. So, but who's taking the risk on that? If it's the concessionaire that's taking the risk, well, then maybe as long as the public safety and convenience are protected, you don't mind them taking a risk on a project like that. And the risks are more visible. What do I mean by visible risks? They actually, the private concessionaires want to know about we pay attention to seismic risk, especially in California. These are things that conventional delivery is very, very aware of. But there's a lot of other risks that may not be as visible. Cost overrun risk, demand risk, those sorts of things. Well, when you have private concessionaires, they want to try to make those as visible as possible. And as one of the companies said, we make the risks visible and then we extinguish them. That's how we make money. We are able to work through these risks, and as we extinguish the risks, the overall risk of the project goes down. We're able to refinance, get a better rate of interest, and make money on the project. But it's not free. There are substantial disadvantages. Transaction costs can be, quite significant. Lawyers, financial and technical advisors, service fees. We have a municipal finance system here in the U.S. that makes municipal bonds tax-free. You don't pay federal taxes on the interest for municipal bonds. So that reduces the cost of interest for municipal bonds, and often P3s don't have access to that. And so that's an increased cost that you have to face, although President Obama has proposed, I think they're called, qualified public investment bonds that would be available to P3 projects that would allow them to get the municipal bond rate, essentially. So if that were to pass Congress, that I think would make a big difference in leveling the playing field between traditional delivery and P3. The complexity really requires public servants to understand and to be able to be good negotiators in these projects. You need to either have your own civil servants qualified to evaluate, or you need to be able to hire the advisors that can come in and make sure that the public sector is getting a good shake for the money. And here in California and elsewhere, there have been big concerns on the part of the public labor unions that are concerned about privatizing public jobs. And so that has been a significant issue in California, but it's an issue all over the U.S. So in terms of what's happening here in the U.S., 33 states, District of Columbia, Puerto Rico, now have P3 laws on the books. Most of the action is happening in California, Texas, Florida, and Virginia, with a little bit of action elsewhere. But it's important point to make here that the states in America, the federal government doesn't own very many capital assets. The assets are typically owned by states and localities. And so it's the state law that governs P3s. And that means we don't have a single market. We've got 53 markets in the U.S., infrastructure markets, and a decision to enter one of those markets is an important business decision for any company considering this. No. Interstate system was funded by the feds 90% or more in the 50 states, but it's owned and operated by the state, by state governments. So, unusual in that respect because it was 90% financed, but with few exceptions, roads in national parks, roads in military bases, the federal government doesn't own assets. So we really see the statutory framework for P3s. It happens at the state level. In California, P3 law expires at the end of 2016, and it, the business is already slowing down apparently because that's 15 months away. So that's not a very long time in terms of these types of transactions. So politics, there is growing support. There was very strong support for P3s under President George W. Bush, and they were strong advocates for looking at this. And Obama administration is also supportive, and I think has become more supportive in the last year. The QPIBs that I mentioned are one aspect of that. President Obama announced an initiative on P3s in August of last year to try to advance. There's not a lot of new money on the table for that, but trying to pull together Department of Treasury, Department of Commerce, Department of Transportation. Lots of experimentation at the state level. You saw 33 states plus. There's a real contested political environment, though, so there's a lot of suspicion about anything new like this, and it often is exploited by project opponents. So they may successfully use concern about P3s to oppose a project that they oppose on other grounds. And litigation is an important part of our system. I mean, that's how an awful lot of decisions are shaped. So we have citizens or NGOs that are involved in and have standing to file suit to stop, change, or slow down projects. So that's an important part of the picture. But we're a huge market. Most people who think about this say we're the biggest potential global market in infrastructure in the next decade. But we are also seeing political risk increasing, and some states with even pretty substantial programs have run into some projects. And I can talk more, if we have time, about some of the recent projects that have run into trouble. We have a big transit project in the Washington metro area, the Purple Line, a light rail project, a $2.4 billion project. Surprise election of a Republican governor in November has now thrown that project, and the bids were originally due on January 9th. So big question about what's the fate of that project. There's millions of dollars been spent by the concessionaires to prepare bids, and now it's much more uncertain. We've had a project in Virginia, US 460, $1.4 billion project that ran into difficulties. Colorado has had a fairly mature P3 program, and a recent highway project there, US 36, ran into some trouble as well. So in terms of things that need attention, for a state to be prepared, One is a pipeline of projects, by which we mean it's usually you're not going to attract companies to come into your market for a single project unless it's extremely large. So it would be nice, it would give your contracting community more comfort if they have a pipeline to say, okay, here are the projects we intend to deliver as P3s over the next 5 years. So that you're getting at least 3 bids on many of these projects, so you're going to lose a third of the time if it's just even just odd. So you don't want to bet it all on a single project. What does it do to supplier diversity? By which I mean small, women-owned, minority-owned businesses. How does it affect that? That's an important constituency in states and on local contractors, another important political constituency in most states. And how do you deal with communication with the public, with the press, with the wider community? These are complicated issues, and it's something that's easy hard to understand and hard to get that across. Speak briefly about Virginia's program, the Virginia Office of Public-Private Partnerships, or VAP3. We had an act in 1995 that got the Virginia program going 20 years ago and gives the VAP3 office is responsible for the developing and implementing a statewide program for delivery. So that office was set up in 2011 as an independent office reporting to the Secretary of Transportation, so they can be available to work with all the divisions, highways, transit, rail, airports, et cetera. Most of the projects have been highway projects. We haven't had a lot of transit projects in Virginia. But they have a full-time staff, so that helps on the how to use staff and make sure that the public interest is well represented in these transactions. They've got established procedures that are well documented, that gives comfort to both, to all parties to the transaction. We haven't talked about unsolicited proposals, but our law allows unsolicited proposals. So even if the state hasn't been thinking about delivering a project as a P3, a consortium can come forward and say, we think build this project and it would provide value to the state, and they will review those. And in 2014, their scope was expanded to handle advising education, which is a big infrastructure user, and other social infrastructure. I should say California, I think there's a UC campus, what is it, development. It's a new, what's the new UC campus? I'm not positive about that. But so I mentioned so these are the projects that are, have been developed or are under development in Virginia. Several projects located around the state. I won't spend a lot of time there. The pipeline, this is the most recent version of the pipeline, which is to say these are projects that are being considered, and this color coding here sort of indicates what's the status of the projects in the pipeline. Not all of them, and I don't think I have it in this. I'm not sure where it is in this presentation, but it's a good time to touch on the issue about toll versus availability payment projects. So I think the toll financing is pretty obvious. You collect tolls from users, that generates revenue. You use the revenue to pay off the loans and pay dividends to the investors. So that's sort of a most commonly used model around the U.S. so far, but we've begun to move into the use of availability payments, which is, and that's how, say, Presidio Parkway is being procured, is with an availability 30-year availability payment that pays a concessionaire for making the facility available. So once it's available, you begin to get paid. The sooner you make it available, the sooner you begin to get paid. There may also be some completion payments or midway payments at the beginning of that. But in the Presidio case, they have guaranteed funding from the state that says this will be delivered over the course of 30 years. It's a state-by-state issue, whether that's counted as debt or whether it's simply an operating expense by the state, and that's something we might talk about, is the accounting treatment of these projects, which is sounds deadly, I know, but is actually pretty important.
Are you going to invent stuff more? I mean, that's a pretty great topic right there. And one thing that's different about there's two kinds of projects you just mentioned. One is being paid for by users through tolls. The other is being paid for, I guess, by taxpayers.
Right.
That's significant.
Oh, yes. So
The question, I mean, is
I know, but I have to have, now I have to, I already was answering, but I kept to now get the,
well, I mean, tell us about, how different those two kinds of projects are.
sure. So the question, again, is back to this issue of demand risk versus AP, or toll versus availability payment financing. So I think the toll side is fairly clear, but I'm happy to expand on that. If the toll revenues fall short, the concessionaire doesn't, the lenders don't get paid, and the equity investors don't get paid dividends either. So that, I think, is fairly self-evident.
And those typically include also
and the question, that typically includes maintaining, and the answer is yes. In fact, the first claim, in most deals, the first claim is the continuity of operations of the facility. So that would be maintenance, operations. So the money that comes in is first allocated to operate the facility. So keep the pavements or the facility in good condition, weather response, and patrolling, safety patrolling, all the things that you do in operating, say, a highway project. Then the next thing is that the lenders get paid. And when the lenders have been paid, if there's still money left, then the equity holders, investors, would begin to get a dividend on their equity. There is reserve funds for various things that have to be taken care of as well. Now, on the AP side, availability payment side, here you sign, the state procures the contract and says, okay, you build Presidio Parkway Phase 2, and we will pay you the following funds, the following payment schedule over the life of this concession contract, which I think in Presidio case is 30 years, but I'm not positive. And so the concessionaire is looking at basically a future flow of payments. There may be appropriation risk, which means that if a future legislature fails to appropriate the funds, then the facility, then the concessionaire doesn't get paid. Now, the flip side of that is the concessionaire can stop operating and making the facility available. So, a pretty good chance that the legislature is not going to say, let's not appropriate the funds, and we will stop, the operation of the Presidio Parkway and access from San Francisco to the Golden Gate Bridge. That's not very probable. So, and is that debt, or is that an annual appropriation? And that's, sort of this is an important accounting question. The rating houses in New York, Moody's, Fitch, and S&P, have a view, and they look at these availability payment obligations for projects, but it's not always, it depends on the strength of the state's credit, how they affect the state's credit rating. That's a good. Right. Well, depending. Yeah. I mean, if you're in a border state, that might not be true. But and if you can figure out how to build a project that has most users coming from outside your state, that's the perfect toll, of course, is one that is paid by people who don't vote in your state. That's that is a really ideal, ideal toll. But it is, I think you can get the design, build, finance, operate, and maintain benefits that come from a good P3 procurement with availability payments. But it is based on the use of taxpayer dollars. So what you're basically saying is, we are going to use the dollars that we're getting better to deliver better services and better facilities. But there's a cap to that because there isn't much appetite for changing, for charging more in taxes. So I think it can still be in the public interest to do that. You do have to pay a profit to the equity investors, and you have to pay the lenders off. And so that is the trade-off: is the juice worth the squeeze, or whatever the term is?
Source of the same.
Yeah. So the question is, that is the major benefit, is that you get lower life cycle costs.
Is it true?
That is the claim, and that's why researchers do research, and that's why we're looking at it. We're early on. It's difficult. I mean, that's a great question. Is it true that the life cycle costs are lower? And the evidence is mixed. There are some good examples of benefits that have been delivered, but there's a couple of problems. One, compared to what? Compared to conventional delivery. Well, we don't do the greatest job of keeping track of conventional delivery. So if you want to say, what are the life cycle costs of conventional delivery that we've been doing for 100 years, that is a hard question to answer. And it's hard particularly to allocate it correctly to a particular facility to compare and make an apples to apples comparison. So that's hard to do, because at a national level, the states are not necessarily comparable in the way that they treat these things. And states hate to be compared to each other. They don't want to be benchmarked against, every state is unique. Every state is above average, and nobody wants to be the 50th out of 50th and then have to go to their General Assembly and say, why are we spending what we're spending and we're still 50th out of 50 on any particular topic. But so that's part of what we're trying to do in the research, is to build an evidence base that begins to allow us to look at that. The evidence is a bit clearer on the design build, on the initial delivery, that you are getting schedule benefits. Projects are being brought to market earlier, and budget adherence, so cost overruns are less. But that's still, I think we're in early days there, and it's a very interesting time to be looking at that. Let me say one more word about Virginia, and I want to just wrap up here. We've had a change of party and a change of government in Virginia in the last 2 years as well, and the new General Assembly just finished meeting earlier this year. Had some great concerns about the P3 law, and they've introduced some additional provisions to try to enhance the transparency and accountability, transparency of that process and accountability for decisions that were taken. We've had some controversial projects. This US 460 that I mentioned was a new 50-mile 4-lane highway, so that we don't build a lot of 50-mile 4-lane highways in America these days, and it had some real problems with wetland impacts that were not anticipated, and it's ended up being very expensive. Elizabeth River Crossings is a new tunnel that's being built across Hampton Roads, in Hampton Roads. It's putting tolls on an existing tunnel before the new tunnel is open. It's caused a huge political uproar about that. So the issues of institutional implications, which is sort of where I started, the issues of getting skilled teams that can do the procurement, the finance, and the management of surprises, renegotiations, and bankruptcies, which do occur. Getting the right structures in place in terms of statutes, contract design. I think it's extremely important to be able to monitor. If you have a 50-year concession agreement, you can't just forget about it for 50 years. You need to be out there making sure that the contractor's delivering what they promised to deliver, and if they fail, to impose the legal penalties that are written into the contract. So it doesn't go away. It's something that you can ignore. A little bit of data on construction. Here are a couple of projects. There's something called, when you do an evaluation, called the public sector comparator. concerns about the methodology, about how you come up with that, but what would it cost to deliver this project under conventional procurement? That's called the PSC. So, of course, it's got a lot of assumptions built into it, and that's where there's been some argument. But it's used around the world, and it's one benchmark, albeit an imperfect one. But some projects that have come in significantly below the PSC, which is a good thing. Some projects that have come in cheaper than the next highest bid. That's another way of getting at performance, and you can see those there. And I mentioned alternative technical concepts. So Denver's Fast Track project, that's a transit availability payment, P3 project going from downtown Denver to the Denver airport, a commuter rail system. The contractor came in with 17 alternative technical concepts that they proposed from what the initial asset owner had requested, and that's led to some savings. They believe some savings. 20% lower on the Presidio Parkway PSC, although some critics have said that is not that's not a good benchmark for that project. Port of Miami Tunnel just opened from the port, a connector to the interstate that prevented trucks from having to go through the center of downtown Miami. Lower capital costs, 50% less than the next highest bid. So some issues there. Some other projects, I put the Bay Bridge down and I said nothing. Controversial in print on that. So, but this is what I've been hearing as I've been out here, is that this is a conventional procurement that has had some significant issues. San Francisco Transbay Terminal, another project that's had some significant issues that folks have said if these were done as a P3, there might have been significant public savings. South Bay Expressway is a Southern California project that goes from San Diego to the Mexican border, towards the Mexican border. This is interesting because it defaulted. So came on stream, with demand projections based on real estate development at the southern end of the corridor. They came on stream in November of 2007. There was a little financial crisis that started in about December of 2007, so the development never occurred, the traffic never materialized, the concessionaire lost several $100 million. But it's a good example of the risk transfer working. They took the risk. The risk was not extinguished, and they bit the bullet. Indiana is my favorite project. I taught a graduate course on P3 policy last fall, so the first assignment in August was to read a case study of Indiana Toll Road, which sort of made a huge newsflash. I think it was 07. It could have been 08, where it was purchased $3.8 billion, that should be, from the state of Indiana for a 75-year concession. And lots happened, a financial crisis and so forth, but the project went bankrupt in October of 2014, so right in the middle of the semester. It's a perfect opportunity to talk about current events. And had the head of Cintra, which was one of the concessionaires, come and talk to the class, saying, Macquarie lost $700 million on that deal, but we will be back to bid to take it out of bankruptcy for something probably on the order of the initial $3.8 billion, maybe a little bit more. And then Tuesday of this week, the news, Indiana bankruptcy court announced that it's sold for $5.7 billion. So somebody has bought the lease, an Australian pension fund has bought the lease for $5.7 billion, which I'm still stunned. So the question of what are these projects worth is a really interesting question. How do you value the infrastructure? And I won't talk. I can talk about Elizabeth River, but I want to. So we talked about most of these things. Except I would say at this point, it's hard to know how to evaluate. So was Indiana a failure? Macquarie or Cintra, and you've lost $700 million, and now you've lost the opportunity to buy the project out of bankruptcy? Yes, it's a failure. But how about to the citizens of Indiana? They got $3.8 billion, and they used that money to build facilities all over the state. the road has continued to operate safely through bankruptcy. So what's the social impact of that? It's hard to say. So evaluating success and failure, I think, is a little bit difficult. So I'm quoting your fearless leader here about not being able to solve our problems with the same thinking and institutions and research we've used when we created them, and I think that's where we are with P3s today. The service is changing. Government roles are changing. It's a different policy environment. There's some leadership challenges with it, and we need new ways to try to communicate with users and constituencies. So that's our main topic at the center at George Mason. So happy to take any questions in the time that we've got. So the question is, briefly, how do you get from no experience to pipeline of projects in terms of training up the state to do that? And it's a great question. And there's been work not only in the U.S., but OECD has written some reports about what are the better institutional structures to have. Part of it is your statutory, and they came up with, I think, 8 factors that you needed to be P3 ready. For your state to be P3 or your country to be P3 ready. Part of it is the institutional capacity, and the challenge there is you need to hire some people who are government employees who can work in this area, and or hire advisors. And there's a lot of folks who consulting firms, law firms that advise. Nossaman is a company, for example, that does a lot of advising. They work only on the government side, so they only take government clients, so they're always representing the asset owner. So they can advise. Ernst & Young has an infrastructure practice where they advise some states on the asset owner side, but they also may be involved as advisors on the concessionaire side. So there's a lot of advising services out there. You need you need some champions in the state government who are willing to try to allocate the resources to make that possible. So it is not something that it's not sort of in a box where you can figure it out. Although there are also, I guess the Canadians, and there's a couple, I think in Texas, they're trying to develop a sort of an advising center that can go out and advise agencies on how to assess their asset portfolio, which capital needs might be good candidates for P3s, and then develop it. So there's, I think there is a good body of practice, but that's also partially our mission, is to try to help build the expertise level that is needed on the public side in particular to help take advantage of to do this wisely, because it's not good for every project. Other questions? Oh, yes, that was the other question, was what about sub-state units, cities and counties? And absolutely, after the states, the big asset owners are the cities and counties of the country. Cities own, quite a bit of, they own transit properties. Typically, in many cases, are the transit property asset owner. Often the water district asset owner as well. And so some of the same issues apply. There is a size and scale issue. You know, if you're a water district, I forget there's 15,000 water districts in the U.S. or something like that. So, you know, they typically aren't going to do this every year, you know, or every 10 years even. You're entering into multi-decade transactions. And I think National Association of Counties has done some work where they're being, you know, trying to build some training capability and some contracts that allow counties to have access to advice for how to approach this. But I think you know, that is something that is and Presidio is an interesting case, Presidio Parkway, because there, you know, the city is funding a portion of that project from their sales tax revenues that are administered by San Francisco County Transportation Authority. So, you know, SFCTA has people who are, you know, monitoring and looking at how they're making sure that they're getting what they're paying for in terms of their contributions to that project. So it's more roles than simply being an asset owner. There may be a financing role as well. Other questions? Yes, in the back. Well, that is an interesting question. I have not seen anybody who's looked at that particular issue of saying, you know, how does it affect the life costs, if you will, of social services to workers who are displaced. I think experience with conversions have, you know, that usually the concessionaire is not, even if it's a Spanish concessionaire, they're not bringing in people from Spain to work in these jobs. You know, they typically hire. You know, they're hiring locally, and in many cases, the workers have the option to either remain with their current employer or convert. And so that is the practice that I'm most aware of. So usually it's a voluntary transfer. So, and usually the workers have been accepting it because the benefits and the work conditions and the pay is better. So I don't think it's quite correct to say that these go to minimum wage jobs, because most of the, you know, I think most of the maintenance worker jobs are, you know, you need quite a bit more expertise and training to do the maintenance work than you would be able to get paying minimum wage, even in a bad labor market. So, but it's an interesting area that might be interesting to research. So thank you. And I guess I didn't repeat that question. Got to train these guys. But the question was, what is the impact on the workers who may be displaced by conversions? Other questions? Yeah. Well, so the question is, you know, how does you provide a, you know, the asset owner is almost, you know, is the government entity usually, or very often the state. How does the public face of that asset ownership how do you reassure the public? And also, how do you make sure that through bankruptcies, renegotiations, defaults, and so forth, that the public interest is protected? So it's a great question. I think if you look around the world, experience has been pretty mixed. There's been a lot of P3 development in South America, and very, very frequently, over half the time, you have what is referred to in the literature as the winner's curse. So the person who comes in with the lowest bid for taking on an availability payment project or some sort of toll project gets the contract, and then sometimes before they even start the work is back saying, "Oh, we can't do it," and we need. You get into a hold-up situation where they come back and say, "We can't do it. We had a problem, so we're either going to have to walk and you'll have to rebid it, or we are going to, you have to give us additional funds." The U.S. experience has been pretty different. SR 91 is an interesting case where the state agreed to a non-compete clause that said you cannot build free general purpose lanes on the adjacent highway in which this road was built. And as I understand it, the state said, we can't live with that, so we're just going to build the lanes, and the concessionaire took them to court, and they were required to stop or to buy them out, and they ended up buying out the concessionaire for a considerable sum, and then turning around and releasing the property back to the same concessionaire for operations and maintenance. But after a couple $100 million had changed hands. So of course today, 2015, nobody writes a non-compete clause like SR 91's non-compete clause. It's a learning process, and not surprisingly, we learn. We figure out that non-compete might seem good at its face, but when we really understand what it means, we have to correct that. And it's not acceptable for the state to say we're just not going to invest in this corridor for the duration of this concession agreement. But some of the other examples in your question, you ask about Indiana. Doesn't it seem fishy to have a concessionaire who loses $700 million then come back and say, we are going to bid to do this again? Well, yes, I have to say I was pretty surprised when I heard that. But they're evaluating it, as a business opportunity. And in fact, part of the problem with the initial financing of the $3.8 billion was something called a step-up swap agreement, interest rate swap agreement that, stepped up the agreed-upon interest rates from 2007 going forward in increments over 10 years, I think, or something like that. And this was, at a time right before the crisis. So what happened to interest rates? They dropped. So the cost of liquidating that swap grew to $2 billion. So there's no way to get out from under that swap except to declare bankruptcy. So the investors lost their money. But when you come back and say, well, what's the future of this property? Do we believe that the traffic and the revenue? You could certainly say that those concessionaires knew the property. They knew what they were getting into, and I was blown away by this $5.7 billion number that comes back and values the property at a much higher rate. South Bay Expressway, it got built. It's a state-of-the-art facility. They defaulted. They lost a couple $100 million. It got turned. It was sold to Sandag, I think, bought the facility out of bankruptcy, and I think it went all the way to bankruptcy. But they took over the facility. It's a publicly owned facility. The federal government has some financing in it. They took a bit of a haircut on their loan, and they're now 1/3 equity holders in South Bay. They might be happy with this Indiana deal because their investment just might have gotten a lot more valuable in the last 7 days. So I think it is a different world, but I think it's one that has some advantages. And I guess the takeaway from this is we're trying to deliver something different as well. And it's more and more difficult to deliver this bundle of services that we associate with infrastructure in the dynamic environment that we are living in through traditional procurement mechanisms. And if there's better ways to do it, then that's something very worth taking a look Pleasure. Yeah. This is great. I want to have some. If anybody's interested, some cards about our center. So. Sort of